Well, the next vignette here, the sixth one of these vignettes here, now comes to a very negative scene here of judgment. Verse 14, "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and sitting on the cloud was one like a son of man, having a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand." Now, a lot of people take this to be Jesus because he's like a son of man, and that refers back to Revelation 1, ultimately back to Daniel 7. But notice verse 15 says, "Another angel came down out of the temple, crying out with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, 'Put in your sickle and reap.'" I don't think this angel sitting on a cloud in verse 14 is Jesus, because if it is, that means an angel in verse 15 is telling Jesus what to do. And so I think these are both angels here. It's just a picture of a powerful angelic being. What we have here in this last section we'll look at in chapter 14 is two harvests. We have a grain harvest and a grape harvest, but it speaks of coming judgment. And in verses 14 to 16, we have the day of the harvest. And in verses 17 to 20, we have what I call the devastation of Armageddon. The earth is getting ready to be reaped. Now, I like what someone I read years ago said. The angels here in this passage now move from heralding to harvesting. They're moving from heralding to harvesting. And what's happening here is the world is ripe for judgment. He says, "Put in your sickle," the end of verse 15, "and reap, for the hour to reap has come. The harvest of the earth is ripe." And that word literally means dry, like grain that's dry and ready to be harvested. "Then he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped." Look, Jesus came the first time as a sower. He's coming the second time as a reaper. And it's our job now to continue to sow the Word of God. But He's coming back to reap. Now, I think in verses 14 to 16, this is a preview of coming attractions. I think this is a preview of the bowl judgments in chapter 16. When God is going to reap the earth, and He's going to begin to bring His judgment upon the earth. But we move from a grain harvest into a grape harvest. Verse 17, "Another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven." Which, by the way, I mentioned this last night. God sits on a throne in a temple in heaven. The temple on earth, remember, was built after the prototype. So God's in a temple in heaven. And he had a sharp sickle. Then another angel, the one who has power over fire, came from the altar, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, "Put in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, because her grapes are ripe." Now that's a different word that means fully ripe. It's like bursting with juice. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle for a distance of 200 miles. Now this is an appalling, gruesome scene that pictures the severity of God's judgment. And what this is, it's a preview of the campaign of Armageddon. It's going to be mentioned in Revelation 16:16. It's going to be mentioned in Revelation 19 when Christ come back to destroy the Antichrist and his armies that are gathered there. But this is the first mention of it. Now, some have called this passage the grapes of wrath, and that's certainly a graphic picture of what's happening here. But it's a preview of the campaign of Armageddon that will be in the valley of Megiddo there in northern Israel. I know many of you have been there. My wife and I led a tour group to Israel in March, and we went in late February. We went a few days early, and the day we were coming back was March the 13th, right as all this COVID stuff was going crazy, and they'd closed travel from Europe. And it was an interesting time to be in Israel because the streets of Jerusalem were empty. It was eerie, and it was quite a process getting everybody back home. But we had visited while we were there Armageddon, the site there of the Valley of Armageddon. It's 20 miles long and 14 miles wide. When I got back, I was reading on the internet, and someone had an article there kind of pointing out some irony. They said, "Armageddon is now closed." Tour groups can't go there. And I thought, yeah, that's pretty interesting. When Armageddon's closed, things are pretty bad, I guess, when that happens. But we know that ultimately Armageddon's not going to be closed. Christ is going to come there. And the whole campaign of Armageddon is not just going to happen there at Armageddon. It's going to span the entire length of the land of Israel. Notice it's 200 miles. Now it talks about blood coming up from the winepress to the horse's bridle. Now, when I was a little boy, I would hear preachers come and talk about prophecy, and they would talk about Armageddon, and they would say that the blood is going to flow 200 miles as deep as the bridle of a horse. Now, I wasn't the smartest kid in the world, but I thought, man, that's a lot of blood. I mean, I don't know how much blood's in one body, but I mean, it's a lot of blood, and you think it would kind of be going down, if it's just for that area, it would constantly be running off somewhere. And a lot of people take this literally. I take it literally, but I think there's a symbol underneath it. And the picture here is a wine press being trodden. If you know anything about wine presses in that day, there was a large stone cylinder that had an area on top where the grapes would be placed, and people would get in there and stomp the grapes. And then there would be a spout where the juice would go out and go down into an area where it was collected. And I think the picture here is Jesus is going to come and tread the winepress of the fierce wrath of God. And it's saying here, the blood will come out from the winepress up to the horse's bridle. It doesn't say it's going to flow that deep, it's going to come up that high. And the picture is of someone in a wine press, and wine presses, again, are usually about, a couple feet high. Someone stomping the grapes with such severity that it'll squirt the juice all the way up to the bridle of a horse. In other words, up probably another 2 or 3 feet. And the point is, that's some pretty severe stomping to bring that to pass, right? So it's a picture of juice, like blood, squirting up to the horse's bridle out of a wine press. For a distance of 200 miles. It'll engulf the entire land of Israel, the campaign of Armageddon that will take place when Jesus returns. If you go over to Revelation 19 and verse 20, this is kind of the culmination of Armageddon, or verse 19. Saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assemble to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. The beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who'd received the mark of the beast and those who'd worshipped his image. They were thrown alive in the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword which came from the mouth of him who sat on the horse. And the birds were filled with their flesh. The sword out of Jesus' mouth speaks of his word. And I remember years ago at Dallas Seminary in a class on Revelation with Dr. Dwight Pentecost. And he'd sit up there kind of with his arms crossed, with his coat and tie on, kind of hunkered down behind his lectern. And he said, all Jesus is going to have to do when he comes back is just say, drop dead, and it's going to all be over. I mean, it's really not going to be a battle at all, the campaign of Armageddon. Jesus will come back, and it says in 2 Thessalonians, he's going to slay the Antichrist with the breath of his mouth. But this picture here is a picture of severity. But remember, God is merciful and God is patient. And He's waiting. And notice He's not going to come until it's ripe, till everything's ripe. And this world is ripening that we live in, isn't it? It's ripening for judgment. So you and I need to be aware of that, and we need to be urgent in our own lives in the way we're living and what we're doing and how we're living for Christ. Well, let me close here in chapter 15. This is the shortest chapter in the book of Revelation. I call this the Temple of Doom and the Seven Bowls. Just kind of a little bit of housekeeping.